In 1944, George Stinney Jr. was just 14 when a rush to judgment sent him to his death in South Carolina's electric chair.
Who was once the youngest death row inmate in Indiana, committed suicide today in Indianapolis. Cooper was sentenced to death 16 years old.
This is the way she looked when she was 15. She was arrested and charged with the murder of 78-year-old Bible school teacher Ruth Pelkey.
What kind of crime makes a teenager face the death penalty? In the U.S., a few shockingly young people have been sentenced to death row. Kids barely old enough to drive, yet condemned to die. And while some of them might have been too young to be executed, their crimes were so violent, so disturbing, that age offered no shield from the ultimate punishment. Here are the youngest people sentenced to death row in the U.S.
So we began to prove our allegiance to Satan by breaking God's commandments. And in the end, there was only one that remained unbroken. You shall not murder.
We decided that was it. And we did a ritual one night and we started talking about it and we decided, okay, let's do it, Let's prove our allegiance to Satan.
That was Sean Sellers, remembered as one of the coldest killers of his time, and uniquely, the only person in the U.S. to be executed for a crime committed before turning 17, after the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. You see, at just 16 years old, Sellers and his friend Richard Howard entered a Circle K convenience store late on September 8, 1985. Armed with a revolver, Sellers opened fire on 35-year-old clerk Robert Bauer, who was behind the counter that night. Sellers later confessed to police that he laughed about the killing, describing it as a fantastic prank. According to Howard, Sellers wasn't motivated by money or revenge. He simply wanted to know what it felt like to kill, and disturbingly enough, the two almost got away with it. Months later, on March 5, 1986, Sellers committed an even more horrifying act. Dressed only in black underwear, he slipped into his mother and stepfather's bedroom as they slept. He raised his gun and shot 43-year-old Paul Bellafato in the back of the head. Then, turning the weapon on his mother, Vonda, he fired twice, once as she stirred after the first shot. Afterwards, Sellers ran to Richard Howard's house and confessed to what he had just done. But it didn't take long for investigators to link him to the murders. Under questioning, Sellers admitted not only to killing his mother and stepfather, but also to the Circle K shooting 6 months earlier. As for his motive, Sellers explained that his mother disapproved of his girlfriend, a high school dropout. But what could have seemed like a brutal case of family violence quickly spiraled into something more bizarre when Sellers told the police that he was a practicing Satanist and had carried out a ritual just before pulling the trigger on his parents. His claims were even more shocking, especially after Sellers said he drank his own blood, pledged his soul to Satan, and even scrawled these chilling messages in blood inside his home.
I renounce God. I renounce Christ. I will serve only Satan, to my enemy's death.
Many believed his defense team exaggerated the "Satan made me do it" angle in court. But regardless, the jury wasn't buying what they were selling, and so Sellers was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Even so, Sellers' obsession with the occult was genuine. Growing up in an abusive home, he likely clung to it as a way of feeling powerful. He collected vials of his own blood for rituals and claimed to pray to demons, particularly one he said had control over him, named Ezurate. But in truth, it wasn't the devil pulling the strings. It was the broken mind of a teenager shaped by years of neglect, abuse, and humiliation. In a surprising twist, though, Sellers later renounced Satanism and declared himself a born-again Christian while awaiting execution. And on February 4, 1999, as the lethal injection drugs began to flow into his veins, Sellers quietly sang a Christian hymn until his voice faded away. His case now marks the first time since 1959, when Leonard Shockley was executed in Maryland, that someone who committed a crime at 16 was put to death in the United States. James Terry Roach became the second person executed in South Carolina after the U.S. Supreme Court brought back the death penalty in 1976. But what made his case particularly controversial was the fact that he was just 17 years old when he committed the crime that put him on death row. On October 29, 1977, Roach, along with Joseph Carl Shaw and Ronald Eugene Mahaffey, spent the morning drinking beer and taking drugs. By the afternoon, the trio was driving around looking, in their own words, for a girl to rape. Their search ended when they came across Thomas Taylor and his girlfriend, Carlotta Hartness, sitting in a parked car. After demanding money, the men forced Carlotta into their vehicle. Then, on Shaw's signal, Roach shot and killed Taylor. The group then drove Carlotta to a dirt road where she was stripped, sexually assaulted multiple times by each of them, and then shot, first by Roach and again by Shaw to make sure she was dead. Afterward, they buried the weapon and the stolen belongings before returning to the baseball field where Taylor had been left, checking whether he was still alive. However, their attempt to cover their tracks failed miserably, as eventually, all three were caught and charged with murder. Roach followed his lawyer's advice and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder, along with charges of sexual, assault, kidnapping, and robbery, hoping that admitting guilt might spare him from the harshest sentence. But newsflash, it didn't. And despite his age, Terry Roach was sentenced to death. Subsequently, his attorneys filed several appeals, but everyone was denied. His case even drew international attention, with pleas for clemency coming all the way from the United Nations, various global leaders, and even former President Jimmy Carter. However, South Carolina's governor at the time, Richard Riley, refused to grant mercy. And so, on January 10, 1986, James Terry Roach was placed in the electric chair. And these were his final words.
To my family and friends, there is only 3 words to say: I love you.
At 5:16 a.m., he was declared dead.
Convicted in the murders of 2 little white girls, Stinney's trial reportedly took just 3 hours. The all-white jury deliberated just 10 minutes.
George Stinney was only 14 at the time of his death, but
the judge who threw out the conviction says she found several violations of due process in Stinney's prosecution and that sentencing him to death was cruel and unusual punishment.
On March 24, 1944, 14-year-old George Stinney was outside playing with his younger sister, Amy, when 2 white girls walked up to them, asking if they knew where to find a certain type of flower. Neither George nor his sister had an answer, so the girls moved on. But later that evening, when both girls never made it back home, their families organized a search party. George and his family joined in, and during the search, he casually mentioned to another person that he had seen the girls earlier that day. The next morning, bodies of both girls were found in a shallow ditch by a local pastor's son. And not long after, George was arrested and accused of their murders. Police also claimed he confessed to beating the girls to death and charged him murder, even though there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. Barely a month later, George went to trial. However, his family, along with other black residents, weren't allowed inside the segregated courtroom. His court-appointed lawyer had no experience with capital cases and barely put up a defense. He didn't call any witnesses and hardly cross-examined the state's witnesses. The prosecution also relied only on the sheriff's account of George's supposed confession, and after just 10 minutes of jury deliberation, the all-white panel found him guilty and sentenced him to death. On June 16, 1944, literally just 3 months after he was even arrested in the first place, George was sent to the electric chair and executed. Standing at only 5'1" and weighing 95 pounds, he was so small that guards had difficulty securing him in the chair, which was built for adults. When the switch was pulled and 2,400 volts of electricity shot through his body, the oversized mask covering his face slipped off, revealing tears running down his cheeks. And at just 14 years old, George Stinney became the youngest person executed in the United States during the 20th century. Nearly 70 years later, in December 2014, Sumter County Circuit Judge Carmen Mullen overturned George's conviction, ruling that his trial had been fundamentally unfair. She noted that his court-appointed lawyer had failed him completely since he didn't investigate the case, never asked for more time, didn't push for a change of venue, barely questioned witnesses, and presented little to no defense. Judge Mullen also noted that she could imagine no greater injustice than the violation of George's constitutional rights. Either way, for George's surviving family, the ruling brought long-awaited relief, lifting the weight of him being remembered as a cold-blooded killer for a crime he likely knew nothing about.
May his soul rest truly in peace.
Cooper was once the youngest person on death row in Indiana. Police say she shot herself Tuesday morning. Her body was found in a wooded area near her house.
For maybe 10, 15 years into my sentence, I really didn't even understand what happened. Honestly, I mean, I sat and tried to figure it all out, and for years I couldn't figure it out.
Paula Cooper is the youngest woman ever sent to death row. At just 15, she took a life and was sentenced to die, only to end up taking her own life in the end. It all began on a warm spring afternoon in May 1985, as 4 teenage girls knocked on the door of 78-year-old Ruth Pelka in Gary, Indiana. They told her they were looking for religious guidance, but that wasn't the truth. Once they were inside, 15-year-old Paula Cooper suddenly turned violent, attacking Ruth and stabbing her more than 33 times. The girls eventually escaped with just $10 and the elderly woman's car. But it didn't take long for the police to catch them. Cooper and the others quickly admitted to what they had done, and in 1986, Paula Cooper was sentenced to death. Her case exploded into national and even international headlines, sparking fierce debate about whether a teenager should ever face the death penalty. At the time, Indiana law allowed as young as 10 to be tried as adults, meaning Cooper could actually be sentenced to die. But many pointed out that the punishment seemed racially biased, arguing that a white child in her situation likely wouldn't have faced the same outcome. Regardless, more than 2 million petitions were sent to the Indiana Supreme Court, and even Pope John Paul II asked for mercy through an emissary from the Vatican. But perhaps the most surprising supporter of all was Ruth Pelk's own grandson, Bill Pelk, a steelworker from Indiana. Most of Ruth's relatives initially supported Cooper's death sentence, but Bill eventually had a change of heart. He came to believe that his grandmother, a woman of deep faith, would have forgiven Paula. And if Ruth could have forgiven her, Bill felt he needed to as well. So eventually, in July 1989, when Paula was 19, her death sentence was reduced to 60 years in prison. She then spent nearly 3 decades behind bars before waking free in 2013 and at age 44. But of course, life on the outside also needed a massive adjustment. Paula had to learn things most people take for granted, like how to use a cell phone, how to manage a home, and how to navigate the internet. She got a good job, earned respect from her co-workers, and found support from the city's Roman Catholic Archbishop. She also fell in love and was warmly welcomed by her fiancé's family. But despite all her progress, Paula knew forgiveness wouldn't come from everyone, and she admitted she couldn't forgive herself either. The struggle to move on left her sinking into depression, and just 2 years after her release, the weight of it all became too much to bear. On May 26, 2015, Paula drove to a parking lot near a street where her fiancé, a landscaper, had planted her favorite red begonias. It was also a place they had spent time together, riding around on his father's old Harley as he worked on restoring it. Paula sat under a tree, wrote her final letters, and left a tape recording on the front seat of her Toyota Corolla. Then, holding a pistol, she pressed it to her head and pulled the trigger, ending her life on the spot.
So when I get out, I mean, I don't care if I have to sweep floors, wash dishes, or flip hamburgers. I'm gonna take whatever I can get, you know, just to get on my feet and show people that I deserve a chance.
When people hear the name Scott Carpenter, the first thing that usually comes to mind is one of NASA's early astronauts who left Earth for space. But the Scott Carpenter we're talking about here didn't reach the stars. Instead, he sent someone to the clouds in a much darker way. And that's by taking their life. You see, on February 6, 1994, 19-year-old Scott Carpenter walked into a small convenience store near Lake Eufaula in eastern Oklahoma. He asked the owner, 56-year-old A.J. Kelly, if he could buy some bait. Kelly then went into the storage room to get it, but Carpenter followed him in and brutally stabbed Kelly to death. Now, Carpenter might have gotten away with it, but fate wasn't on his side because just as the attack happened, two men entered the store. One of them a retired Oklahoma City police detective. They saw Carpenter, hands covered in blood, standing over Kelly's body. Carpenter then bolted, but not before those men chased him out and jotted down his license plate number as he sped off in his truck. Police eventually caught up with him about an hour later, and he was formally charged with first-degree murder. However, during his trial, Carpenter took the witness stand for an hour, trying to justify why he thought the death penalty was the right punishment for himself. And so, despite his age and having no prior convictions, the court sentenced him to death. In love with that verdict, Carpenter dismissed his state-appointed lawyer from the Oklahoma Indigent Defense System and even wrote directly to the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. In his letter, he explained that he had fired his attorney because they weren't honoring his wish to stop appealing his death sentence. He had obviously made peace with dying and wanted it to happen quickly. So just 3 years later, on May 8, 1997, Carpenter was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He spent his last few days like he had spent the months leading up to it, watching television for hours in isolation. And in the hours before his execution, his mother visited him for about 80 minutes. But no other relatives came, and none chose to witness the execution. For his last meal, Carpenter requested a Southern-style feast made up of barbecued beef ribs, corn on the cob, baked beans, potato salad, hot rolls, sweet lemonade, and pecan pie with whipped topping. At 12:22 a.m., a doctor pronounced him dead just minutes after the lethal injection coursed through his veins. This made him the youngest person executed in the United States since capital punishment was reinstated in 1976. On October 26, 1979, 30-year-old Sarah Dawn Lawrence was brutally murdered during a home burglary carried out by J. Kelly Pinkerton. In the attack, he raped and stabbed her more than 50 times before assaulting her again, all while her children slept just down the hall. Now, this crime was shocking not only for its brutality, but also because the killer, Pinkerton, was just 17 years old. Born and raised in Amarillo, Texas, Pinkerton had dropped out of school as a teenager to work as an apprentice butcher. It was during that period that he committed Sarah's murder. Investigators followed a trail of footprints leading from the crime scene to his home a few blocks away. He was brought in for questioning but released due to a lack of solid evidence. 6 months later, on April 9, 1980, 25-year-old Sherry Welch, a former beauty queen, was killed in the back room of a furniture store she managed in Amarillo. Detectives initially had no leads, but they continued investigating Sarah Lawrence's murder, examining bloody palm prints found on her furniture. By late summer, those prints were matched to Pinkerton, leading to his arrest on September 26th and first-degree murder charge. By now, on May 30th, 1981, after a trial with a jury of 7 men and 5 women, Pinkerton was convicted and sentenced to death. The following year, in April 1982, he was tried in El Paso for the murder of Sherry Welch. Bite marks found on Welch's breast matched Pinkerton's teeth impressions, securing another conviction and a second life sentence. As his execution dates drew closer, multiple attempts were made to halt the process. 3 separate times, Pinkerton was granted last-minute stays. On one occasion, the order came just 26 minutes before his scheduled execution. Ultimately, however, his reprieves ran out. On May 14, 1986, the Supreme Court declined to hear 2 last-ditch appeals, one written by Pinkerton himself from his cell, and rushed to Houston by his mother. Lower courts, including U.S. District Judge Hayden W. Head Jr., the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans, and finally the Supreme Court, all rejected his requests. The following day, May 15, 1986, was his final one. That afternoon, he was visited by his parents, Margie and Jean Pinkerton, along with a family friend, Sari Chase. He had been fasting in recognition of Ramadan. His last meal was a plate of fish sandwich, French fries, and milk. When the time came, his father Gene stood in the death chamber just feet away, gripping the rail as he watched. And for his last words, Pinkerton said,
"I bear witness to Allah. I ask for your forgiveness."
At 1:25 a.m., Pinkerton was pronounced dead by lethal injection. He became the 57th person executed in the United States and the 13th in Texas since the Supreme Court reinstated capital punishment in 1976. At the time of his death, he was the youngest person executed since executions resumed in 1977 and only the third put to death for crimes committed as a minor. In the early hours of August 22, 1979, 18-year-old Jesse De La Rosa and an accomplice carried out 2 armed robberies at convenience stores in San Antonio. Armed with a .32 caliber pistol, De La Rosa opened fire on the store clerks in both locations. At a 7-Eleven, the clerk, 27-year-old Masoud Ghazali, a former Iranian Air Force captain, was killed after being shot twice in the head. While at a nearby stop-and-go, clerk Patricia Johnson was also shot twice but survived. She later identified De La Rosa as the shooter. Investigators were able to tie him to the 7-Eleven shooting through his fingerprints, one found on a beer can near the register and another on the cooler door where Ghazali's body was discovered. 5 days later, on August 27, 1979, police arrested De La Rosa around 5:30 p.m. Now at first, he told officers he had been drinking and smoking marijuana that night while staying at a friend's place, but after hours of questioning, he eventually admitted to the crimes. Prosecutors charged him with 2 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to death. He filed 3 separate appeals, but each one was denied. And on May 14, 1985, just a couple hours before the execution, De La Rosa had his last meal, a plate of steak, before spending about 20 minutes on the prison phone with a longtime friend, Margie Garcia, from San Antonio. Shortly before 8 p.m., he also received communion from Reverend Stephen Walsh, a prison chaplain. At midnight, De La Rosa was secured to the gurney. His final words were directed to his stepmother, Carmen, telling her he loved her. And at 12:17 a.m., he was executed by lethal injection with both his father and stepmother present. Meanwhile, his accomplice in that robbery, Alejandro Alcorta Garcia, was sentenced to life in prison for aggravated robbery. On April 19, 1994, 17-year-old Napoleon Beazley committed a crime in Tyler, Texas, that would eventually cost him his life. But Beazley wasn't always a criminal. Growing up, he was far from that. Raised in Grapeland, Texas, Napoleon Beazley seemed destined for success. An honor student, athlete, and senior class president who dreamed of Stanford Law. But behind that polished image, he was mixing with the wrong crowd, already dealing drugs and carrying firearms. Now the day of the crime started out like any other. After track practice, Beazley borrowed his mom's car and headed to Tyler with 2 friends, 19-year-old Cedric Coleman and 18-year-old Donald Coleman. Their goal? To steal a luxury car. At first, they tried targeting a Lexus at a restaurant. Beazley even walked up to the driver with a .45 caliber pistol, but backed off when the man went inside his car. Still, that didn't stop him. Beazley told Cedric to circle back into Tyler, and soon they spotted 63-year-old businessman John Luddig driving his 1987 Mercedes-Benz with his wife, Bobby Luddig, seated in the passenger seat.
They followed the Luddigs home, and as the couple pulled into their garage, Beazley walked in with his pistol while Donald carried a sawed-off shotgun trailing behind. Beazley then shot John Luddig twice in the head, killing him instantly. He then fired at Bobby Luddig, who survived by playing dead. However, when Beazley noticed her move, he told Donald to finish her off, but Donald refused, claiming she was already dead, even though she wasn't. Beazley then grabbed the car keys, backed out the Mercedes, but ended up crashing it into a retaining wall, causing him to abandon the vehicle and escape the scene. On June 5, 1994, police caught up with Beazley, and the following year, he went to trial in Smith County, Texas. Both Cedric and Donald Coleman testified against him, having already taken plea deals.
Each received a 40-year federal sentence, along with state capital murder convictions that carried life terms, though they would still be eligible for parole after 40 years. But for Beazley, no such deal was on the table. Why? Because the victim's son, Jay, Michael Luddig, wasn't just anyone. He was a federal judge, and with those kinds of connections, mercy was never going to be part of the bargain, ultimately leaving Beazley with the maximum sentence, the death penalty. Of course, Beazley's appeals dragged on for years. His legal team focused on one central argument. He was only 17 at the time, just 3.5 months shy of 18. They argued that executing someone that young went against international law and basic standards of decency. But with 3 justices, Antonin Scalia, David Souter, and Clarence Thomas, recusing themselves because of their connections to Judge Luddig, only 6 of the 9 justices at the Supreme Court reviewed his appeal, ultimately leading to it being denied. In 2001, Beazley nearly faced the needle, but in a last-minute twist, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals stepped in and put things on hold, literally just 4 hours before his scheduled execution. It bought him some time, but not much. Fast forward to May 28, 2002, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 10-7 against reducing his sentence to life and 13-4 against halting the execution altogether. And that very evening, at just 25 years old, Napoleon Beazley was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. In his final words, he spoke about hope for peace and urged people to think about future generations, all while acknowledging the full weight of what he had done. On April 12, 1927, a white girl from Little Rock, Arkansas, named Floella McDonald, was brutally murdered. Her body was discovered in the belfry of the First Presbyterian Church, her head smashed with a brick. On May 1st, after a 24-hour interrogation, authorities claimed that 16-year-old Lonnie Dixon, a black teenager who lived in the area, had confessed to Floella's murder. Just 18 days later, on May 19th, Lonnie's trial began, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. It took place in Pulaski County under heavy protection from the Arkansas National Guard, whose presence was meant to prevent mob interference. Lonnie had been indicted for both rape and murder, charges that carried the death penalty at the time.
Now, the details of the trial itself are not really known, but what we do know is that it was fast and very biased. The prosecution leaned on circumstantial evidence, like Lonnie's connection to the church through his father's job working there and a supposed confession. But whether that confession was genuine or coerced remains an open question, especially since black defendants of that era were often pressured into giving false statements during brutal interrogations. The jury, almost certainly made up entirely of white men, deliberated for only 12 minutes before finding Lonnie guilty of murder. Interestingly, there's no record of a rape hots conviction, suggesting that the charge was either dropped or simply not pursued. Still, the court sentenced Lonnie Dixon to death by electrocution. It was the harshest punishment possible, reflecting not only the severity of the crime, but also the racial dynamics of the era. Less than 2 months after his arrest, Lonnie Dixon was executed in the electric chair in Pulaski County. The date was June 24, 1927, his 17th birthday. Even setting aside the fact that he was a minor, many still question whether Lonnie Dixon was truly guilty or simply a scapegoat in a city desperate for justice after Floella's murder. That question still lingers nearly a century later. Elijah Paige was 25 years old when he was executed by lethal injection in South Dakota, but he was only 18 when he forced another teenager to drink hydrochloric acid during a bizarre armed robbery. On March 12, 2000, 19-year-old Chester Allen Paige was brutally kidnapped, tortured, and murdered by Paige and his accomplices in Lawrence County. Now that day began in the most ordinary way possible. Paige had Elijah Paige, Briley Piper, and Daryl Hoadley over at his place. The 4 of them knew each other and decided to hang out at Paige's family home in Spearfish, playing video games. Paige's mother and sister were away on vacation in Florida, leaving the house practically empty.
Later, the group piled into Page's Chevrolet Blazer and headed to the house where Paige, Piper, and Hoadley were staying. However, that's where things took a dark turn. Paige pulled out a .22 caliber pistol that he had actually stolen from Page's home earlier. He ordered Paige onto the floor, and the real plan came into focus. The three of them wanted to rob Page's family home, and they didn't want to leave behind a witness. So as Paige lay on the floor, Piper began kicking him until he was unconscious. They then tied him up with a cord and placed him in a chair, pinning his feet down with a tire iron so he couldn't move. When he eventually regained consciousness, Paige begged them to let him go, but instead, they forced him to drink a mixture of beer, crushed pills, and hydrochloric acid. Paige also took his ATM card, and the men openly discussed killing him while he was sitting right there. Eventually, they kidnapped him and drove to a remote gulch, where the torture continued. Paige was stripped, beaten, stabbed, and finally had his head crushed to death with rocks. About a month later, Page's body was found, setting off an immediate investigation. And seeing how viral the case had become, Elijah Paige fled to Texas but was eventually caught there. And once in custody, he confessed to everything. In 2001, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. He gave up his right to a jury trial, leaving his fate in the judge's hands. Of course, Paige's defense team did their job by trying to highlight his abusive childhood and his young age. But the court wasn't swayed. Judge Johnson sentenced Paige to death. His friend Piper, who also pleaded guilty, was sentenced to death, while Hoadley went to trial and got life without parole. Elijah's execution, however, didn't happen right away. It was delayed first over issues with South Dakota's lethal injection protocol, and then again out of respect for a soldier's funeral. But in 2007, once the law was amended, the state moved forward with it. Consequently, on July 11, 2007, at the South Dakota State Penitentiary in Sioux Falls, Elijah Paige was executed by lethal injection. For his last meal, he asked for steak with A1 sauce, jalapeno poppers, onion rings, a salad with ham, cherry tomatoes, bacon bits, shredded cheese, ranch, and blue cheese dressings, plus coffee, iced tea, and ice cream. I mean, you can't blame the man for wanting to have a feast. But anyway, around 9:40 p.m., guards escorted him into the execution chamber and secured him with leather restraints to the gurney. IV lines were placed in both arms. And at 10:02 p.m., Warden Doug Weber asked if he had any final words, to which Elijah simply replied, "No." He was pronounced dead at 10:11 p.m., marking the first execution in South Dakota in 60 years. On a night in 1962, 17-year-old James Andrew Eckles, along with 3 accomplices, took part in the gang rape of a white woman somewhere in Houston, Texas. Eckles and his partners in crime, Lawrence O'Connor, Willie James Rivers, and Rufus Freeman, targeted a young couple, the woman and her white male companion, Marion Jenkins. The two had been sitting inside Jenkins' Falcon car near a street intersection around 9 p.m. when O'Connor and Rivers made their move. O'Connor held a knife to Jenkins' neck, while Rivers, also armed with a long knife, appeared on the other side. They forced their way into the car and took control. Rivers drove a short distance before forcing the couple into the back seat. O'Connor then stole Jenkins' watch, before Eckles, Freeman, and another accomplice named Charles Phillips joined in. Things turned violent quickly as Eckles kicked Jenkins in the stomach before the group carried out the rape. Thankfully, she survived, but the law wasn't about to let Eckles and his crew walk away from what they'd done. Within a year, they were all indicted for rape. Eckles, though, got a separate trial in Houston, right in the heart of the segregated South. And let's be real, a black teenager accused of raping a white woman back then was literally the worst thing that could happen to anyone. The prosecution leaned on the victim's testimony, and with an all-white jury, Eckles was quickly convicted and sentenced to death. If we're being honest, his defense lawyers didn't stand much of a chance in that climate, honestly. And even when they appealed in 1963, the higher court upheld the conviction, shutting down any hope of reversal. And so, on May 7, 1964, James Eckles, just 19 years old, was executed by electric chair at the Huntsville unit in Texas. His execution marked two things. One, he became the last person in Texas executed for a crime other than murder. And two, he was also the last juvenile in the United States to be executed for On January 3, 1994, somewhere in Reno, Nevada, two employees were bound, savagely beaten, and killed with a hammer and crowbar inside a U-Haul, all for just $2,400 in stolen cash. One of the attackers was 21-year-old Alvaro Calambro. He had moved from his home country of the Philippines to Downey, California, at the age of 10 before eventually settling in Reno. He had a difficult childhood and struggled with mental health issues, including what was described as a borderline intellectual disability. Now, on that night, Calambro teamed up with his brother-in-law, Duke Kong Huyen, who had recently lost his job at that same U-Haul location. The two went in with robbery on their minds. They hogtied 37-year-old Peggy Crawford and 21-year-old Keith Christopher, then unleashed a horrifying level of violence on both victims, starting with Calambro, striking Christopher repeatedly with a hammer before driving a crowbar through his head. Crawford endured a similar fate, suffering fatal blows from the same weapons. After leaving the store, Calambro and Huyen escalated their spree by robbing a gun shop in Reno before fleeing to California. However, they were eventually caught, and both men confessed not only to the U-Haul murders, but also to the series of other crimes they committed along the way. In California, they were convicted of 28 felonies before being extradited back to Nevada to face trial for the killings. In 1994, Calambro pleaded guilty to Peggy Crawford's murder. A panel of 3 judges sentenced him to death, and in the same hearing, he also admitted to killing Keith Christopher. A separate panel later handed down a second death sentence for that crime. Now, at that point, Calambro had pretty much accepted his fate, and he made it known that he wanted his punishment. Still, others tried to intervene. His mother, Lydia, stepped in as his next friend and filed motions in federal court, arguing that her son was mentally incompetent and hadn't received proper legal representation. She also raised concerns about a violation of the Vienna Convention since Philippine officials weren't promptly notified of his arrest in 1994. The Philippine government itself joined in, demanding a halt to the execution on those same grounds. But the U.S. Supreme Court turned down the request, ruling that the appeal had been filed too late. On June 12, 1998, the Nevada Supreme Court briefly paused the execution for a fast-tracked hearing. But by April 1999, every legal avenue had closed. That final night came on April 5, 1999, when at 9 p.m., Calambro was escorted through an old submarine-style door into Nevada State Prison's death chamber in Carson City. His last meal had been steak, rice, corn, apple pie, and a Sprite. However, once strapped to a gurney with 8 car seatbelts, he didn't resist. He also told the prison's director, Bob Bayer, "I regret it," right as his body was jammed with those lethal drugs. And at 9:06 p.m., just 2 minutes after the injection started, he was pronounced dead. On January 16, 1958, 16-year-old Leonard Melvin Shockley and his 22-year-old brother, Harold Edward Shockley, killed 39-year-old shopkeeper Sarah Hearn during yet another botched robbery. Desperate for money, both brothers decided to rob Hearn's general store, certain she would be working alone. And not so surprisingly, they were right. Hearn, a 39-year-old mother of 3, was in the shop without help when Leonard suddenly attacked her. He drove a large hunting knife into her back, stabbing her multiple times before cutting her throat in a frenzied assault. Not long after, Clarence Bishop, a respected black customer, walked into the store and was horrified by what he saw. He fled immediately and later gave police a detailed description of both brothers and their car. His account provided a key lead, one that galvanized the local black community. Many in the community deeply resented the Shockleys for killing Hearn, a white woman they regarded with respect. Thanks to Bishop's testimony, the brothers, who were themselves black, were quickly arrested. Leonard went to trial later in 1958 in Dorchester County. And despite his age, the sheer brutality of the attack, multiple stab wounds, and the throat slashing led to a first-degree murder conviction. The sentencing was severe. Leonard received the death penalty by gas chamber, while Harold was handed a life sentence. The difference was likely due to Harold's prior record and the perception of his lesser role in the killing. Leonard's appeals were short-lived. His attorneys couldn't overturn the conviction or secure clemency. Higher courts upheld the verdict, stressing that the evidence against him was overwhelming. On April 10, 1959, at just 17 years old, Leonard Shockley was executed in the gas chamber at the Maryland Penitentiary in Baltimore. His execution made history. He became the last person in the United States put to death while still under 18, and the second to last executed for a crime committed at age 16. It would take another 40 years before the U.S. carried out an execution for a murder committed at that age. As for Harold, he eventually served his time and was released from prison, leaving his younger brother's execution as the darker legacy remembered from that crime. Scott Hayne was the last person executed for a crime committed as a juvenile in the U.S., and let's just say some people believe he fully deserved what he got. On October 6, 1987, 17-year-old Hayne and his friend Robert Lambert carjacked a car in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Inside were Michael Houghton and Laura Sanders. Both teenagers robbed the couple, forced them into the trunk, and then set the car on fire, burning Houghton and Sanders to death. Just 3 days later, on October 9th, police arrested Hayne and Lambert. By 1988, both were on trial, convicted of capital felony murder, and sentenced to death by lethal injection. Years later, in 1994, an appeals court said Hayne deserved a new sentencing hearing because the jury hadn't been told about the option of life without parole. But even with a second jury, nothing changed. They still gave him the death penalty. After that, Hayne kept trying to fight it, but every appeal was shot down. His final shot was in 2002, when the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his case. His lawyers had argued that executing someone for crimes they committed under 18 was unconstitutional, but the court stood its ground. Meanwhile, Lambert's story took a very different turn. He was also sentenced to death at first. But in 2005, Oklahoma's Court of Criminal Appeals ruled he was legally, mentally retarded. That ruling took him off death row and replaced his sentence with life in prison without parole. Naturally, that made some people wonder if Hayne should have gotten a second chance too. But unfortunately for him, that never happened. When it was finally his time, Hayne ordered 3 cheeseburgers, 3 sides of onion rings, ice cream, and a slush drink for his last meal. He chose not to give a final statement. And at 12:27 a.m., on April 3, 2003, Scott Allen Hayne was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Oklahoma.